I'm Dan Smolen. I built a successful executive career in marketing and communications before becoming a top headhunter and founding my own executive search firm. Now get this, every day, mainstream media runs stories in which old school bosses and thought leaders frame your work and workplace issues in ways that are often divisive and unmeaningful. And that's just crazy. The time has come for you to answer the question, what's your work fit, so that your work and career fit who you are, how you want to live, and what you want your lasting contributions to be. What's your work fit? It answers your questions and tackles the issues that keep you up at night about advancing your career in this time of workplace revolution. So let's get started. Hey, good day, everyone. Dan Smolen here from What's Your Work Fit. Thank you so much for being a part of this experience. We could not do this live show without you. Today marks the end of our spring 2025 season. It's been phenomenal, and I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too. Our new live shows will come back after Labor Day. We're going to give everybody a break from live shows until the summer season has ended. However, we are going to pre-record some shows with some special guests during the summer, some news about that as it develops. So keep watching the social media that we put out for more details about that. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you for making this spring season of What's Your Work Fit an unqualified success. Okay, let me get to a little self-promotion here. If you haven't already, please engage with What's Your Work Fit on the two platforms that we have. You can join us on LinkedIn Live by hitting that plus follow button. We're also on the What's Your Work Fit YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to us there. One new thing that we've started this year is a What's Your Work Fit Substack. And please join us there at dansmolen.substack.com. What's really cool about this destination is it pulls in everything that we do. Written posts, our live and pre-recorded videos, video clips, even our audio podcasts for you to listen to. It's fun. It's easy to use. I'm hoping we can build a subscription early for it. I am not charging a subscription fee, not yet. As a courtesy to everyone out there, I want to give them an opportunity to take a taste for free. And again, we're at dansmolen.substack.com. One more ask, and I do this every week, is that if you enjoy the content and the value that you're getting from What's Your Work Fit, please, 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 please tell 5 of your friends and associates to subscribe to us at What's Your Work Fit on the platform or platforms of their choice. That's it. Let's get to it. It is my great pleasure to welcome to What's Your Work Fit our guest today, Kelly Colón. How are you, Kelly?
I'm good. How are you? It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to finally get you here. I am so excited. You are such a busy person. We'll get into why in a moment. But let me tell you about Kelly. Kelly is the founder of Eledex Consulting and Coaching. She empowers neurodivergent individuals to thrive while helping organizations to foster authentic inclusion. She is also an adjunct professor at the Gerrish School of Business at Endicott College. And I want to talk to you about that later on in the show, because I have, as the spouse of a teacher, unabiding appreciation for everything that educators do. So I'm eager to know what kinds of things that you're learning about your students. Mark Gilbreath, our co-host, isn't here this week, but we have Saele from MorteVita. How are you doing, Fran?
Hi, Dan. I'm great. How are you? And Kelly, great to be with you.
Nice to see you.
Well, let's get right to it. The question that we're going to ask Kelly came from a viewer last season who was interested in learning differences and stylistic differences and cognitive differences that take place in the workplace. And quite simply, he asked, how do I establish a neuro-inclusive workplace? Kelly, please get us started. How does he do that?
Oh, goodness. Well, this is kind of a loaded question. I get this a lot. I mean, I get it a lot from leaders. I get it from the design community and almost every day from just individuals. And I think my answer, if you'll indulge me, for a little bit, might not actually be what you might be expecting. So I can tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to give you a list or a how-to guide, because despite the efforts of others or the expectations, I don't think that we are as a society ready for the execution part of that phase. So it, again, my opinion, and sort of when I have these conversations with individuals, I think if you really want to create a truly neuro-inclusive workplace or neuro-inclusive education environment, doesn't matter. You can insert any kind of place on the backside of it. I think the first step is to stop pretending that everyone's brain works the same. That's the first step. And then I think you also have to recognize that neurodivergent individuals, people who are cognitively different than societally expected norms, they're already in your workplace. They've been there all along. We've just been masking, we're burnt out, and we're adapting to systems that were not designed or built for us. And so I think neuroinclusion as a word, it's not just about checking a compliance box. It's actually a full-blown shift in how we define leadership, how we measure productivity, and how we support humans in our environments. And so, stop designing workplaces and other, physical environments on outdated models like butts and seats, the traditional 40-hour norms, or like forced collaboration with everyone coming back to the office at a forced time, and start understanding human needs. Like, what are the diverse needs that human beings have?
Yeah.
Some people, they don't operate best at 8 a.m. They might be better, at 6 a.m. in a quiet room, while others might have full-blown energetic bursts between 10 and 2. And a neuro-inclusive, I'm going to say workplace because this is what we're talking about, but a neuro-inclusive workplace makes space for both, right? It allows those individuals, despite how they work, to be able to show up, right? And it stops assuming that if somebody needs something different, that it means they're less valuable. And this shift in mindset, it starts at every level, right? It's how we interview, it's how we onboard, it's how we run meetings, it's built into the policies and programs, like in our workplaces. And I think a lot of people want to talk about the physical environment, like how we create a physical neuro-inclusive environment. But we rarely, when we talk about, the lighting and the biophilic elements and all of those things, which are fine, but we never start by asking the most critical question. Actually, before even how do we create a neuro-inclusive environment, the most foundationally critical question is asking, what are the exclusionary practices that we have inside of the social structures of our organizations, and how are those unwritten rules baked into our workplaces that are in fact exclusionary? And that is a hard conversation to have. So it's looking at those hidden rules and how people are supposed to work and how people are supposed to communicate and how people are supposed to engage, and start challenging, is that actually the best way? And is our cultural expectations and unwritten rules the only way to think about collaboration and connection and productivity? And I think most people just want a checkbox.
Yeah.
They want to say, hey, I'm a neuro-inclusive environment. I followed these 15 steps in this notebook that said, do these XYZ things. And and somehow we're magically this neuro-inclusive environment, but they never look and say, wait a minute, what are the potential exclusionary practices that are just inherent in our policies, programs, and places that we don't even think about? I don't know if that's really a answer for your audience member, but
it's a good start. It's a good start, and it's fertile ground. Fran, take it away.
Sure, Dan. Kelly, based on what you just said, it would seem to me that a neurodiverse employee would feel much more comfortable in a highly unstructured, decentralized, and diverse or distributed work environment, where essentially they would have the ability to do things that they feel comfortable doing at home, and things that they feel comfortable doing with others in an office, that they could do that. And they could do that on their own schedule, or utilizing the person on the other end, the people on the other end that they're working with in terms of how they interact best, versus that would be better for them than, I have this picture of a Chinese workplace where there's one guy sitting up on a stand, and then there's 500 people all wearing the same clothes doing the same thing. So I don't think they would feel comfortable there at all. So I'm just trying to lay some groundwork here that, generally speaking, neurodiverse people would feel better in a less structured environment than a more structured environment. Is that true?
Yes, but
Okay.
so for a sample set of individuals, having less structure, less rigidity actually is better for them in the way that their brains and bodies are wired. But it's a spectrum. Like, human beings are a spectrum. And so there are individuals who, if given full autonomy and self-agency because of the way their brains and bodies are wired, that actually would be detrimental for them. And so I'll give you just an example. I'll use my kids, for example. I have one child who is autistic. I have 4 kids, but one is autistic and one is ADHD. I won't get into the nuances of each of those, except for the fact that my ADHDer really struggles in rigidity and structure, because the very nature of how their brain is wired to sit in one place for any, period of time during a period of energetic depletion would actually be detrimental to their health and well-being. And they wouldn't be productive. They wouldn't be engaging. It would be bad for them to have so much rigidity and structure. But my other one, who is autistic, actually, if they don't have guardrails and they're not really clear about, okay, so on Monday, I'm coming in and I'm doing this from this time to this time. If given the fluidity of making a choice on their own, they actually would struggle in that environment if they didn't have some kind of a guardrail. And so I think the point I'm trying to make is there isn't a one size fits all solution. And when we're talking about true neuroinclusion, it's recognizing that, and I'll just use these 2 neurotypes just because they tend to be sort of opposite. ADHDers, just as a framework, as an overview, gross generalization, ADHDers and autistic individuals, they need different things. But in order for your workplace to be really inclusive, you have to understand what those nuances are and provide opportunities to support both brain types.
Okay, well, that does make sense, and I can see that perspective. Going to the workplace, and I mentioned that neurodiversity is not one of my strengths in this business, but in my little research that I was able to do over the last couple of days, Copilot is saying that 15 to 20% of the global population is neurodivergent. More than 25. Probably.
I mean, that's the statistics. I mean, that's the statistics thrown around everywhere.
Okay, well, that's 1 in 5. I mean, that's still a significant portion of the workforce.
I think it's higher, and I think it's higher for a number of reasons. But yeah, that's a pretty universally accepted statistic that it's usually 1 in 5. I just, given the work that I do, I actually think it's much higher than that.
Okay. Well, given that, the reality is that virtually every organization is going to have a comparable level of neurodivergent people working with them. So
Yeah.
in terms of helping counsel organizations as how to deal with this issue, and what we just talked about in terms of the level of controls that are helpful in a neurodiverse person, how do you structure, what recommendations would you have to managers, HR people, in terms of how they deal with that within their organizations and how they communicate whatever those things are to the line managers, the team leaders, and others who are involved in managing these people?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna answer that question, but I'm gonna preempt the answer with a couple of things. So hopefully you can kind of bear with me. So yes, neurodivergent, diverse thinkers, diverse brains and bodies are in our workplaces. I think the challenge with the neurodivergent population is that those, I will say, I hate this word, but I will use it just for this context, those disabilities are invisible. And so unlike somebody who needs a wheelchair or, needs other physical accommodations, that's easier to solve. So you're right. When you can't see what someone's challenged with, it makes it really hard, even for well-intentioned organizations, to create programs and policies and scaffolding for their employees that makes sense, right? Because if you can't see, how do you address something you can't see?
Right.
So there is that, and I will just make that as a baseline statement. The other thing, before we sort of get too far down the rabbit hole, I want to make sure that you both know, and anybody who happens to be listening, I am not a psychiatrist, psychologist. I am not a clinician. I come at my work from what we would call the social model, not the medical model. I am not licensed or trained. And so everything that I talk about is through lived and learned experience.
Mm-hmm.
I am neurodivergent. I have 4 neurodivergent children. I have 2 neurodivergent nephews, and I have 3 neurodivergent sisters. And I come from a very long line of extremely neurospicy people. So a lot of what I'm saying is just been my experience in the work that I've done, for my whole life. So the reason that I said I think our numbers are higher is because I think what a lot of people forget when they say that 1 in 5, that's like a diagnosis. Those are people that are like getting a clinical diagnosis. And we don't have to get down that rabbit hole, but clinical diagnosis that says I am this or I have that, those are based in the methodology and the belief that anything that is divergent from societally expected norm, so divergent, is something that needs to be treated, cured, like almost like a pathology that needs to be cured.
Right.
Okay. So anybody that says, I'm neurodivergent, I have this diagnosis, that is typically, that 1 in 5 has gone through some sort of medically evaluated process. Why I say it's actually probably a higher number is because our brains, all of our brains are diverse and different. And so you can have someone who needs specific things for their brains and bodies that don't have a clinical diagnosis. That doesn't exclude them from the needs. It excludes them from that statistic that we always use, but it doesn't exclude them from benefiting from any accommodations that we have. And the other thing that I want the audience to recognize when they're looking at their workplaces is that when people say, or when you hear someone say, I am neurodiverse, or we have a neurodiverse workplace, or I'm neurodivergent, there are two, and I'm not going to get too medical, but there are 2 primary, I guess, sort of binary ways to think of it. There's the genetic part, meaning someone like myself and my children who are neurodivergent because that is just literally how we were born. But there's another subset of human beings that are walking around our workplaces, our schools, our communities, our societies, who have what we would call an acquired neurodivergent. So that means that perhaps they had a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, a concussion would be a short-term considered, cognitive difference. Any woman who is in your workplace that is transitioning, into menopause, that is an acquired neurodivergence. Their brain is quite literally changing. And so I want people to recognize that I think there's this misconception that when we're talking about a neuro-inclusive environment or supporting neurodivergent individuals, it's only that diagnosed clinically cohort of humans. And that's not true, which is why I think this conversation about true neuro-inclusion has to go beyond that very narrow focus of ADHD, autism, dyslexia, or sensory integration, things like that. And I've already forgotten what your question was.
I want to back up everything that you're saying, Kelly. And I come from a household where we check all the boxes.
Mm-hmm.
My wife discovered that she is auditory dyslexic. Can you imagine being a gifted teacher and half the room comes from a foreign country and you have to pronounce names? Very, very difficult.
Yep.
But from the frame of ADA, for those who don't know what that is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, among other things, made sure that new construction had accommodations for people who were physically impaired or disabled, and helped my daughter to a certain degree with her learning differences. And after she had a lot of medical issues in school, the problem is that, like you've said, we start every conversation with diagnoses, and I agree with you. There are a lot more people who operate differently than do not. The number of people who are neurotypical is actually overreported.
Yeah.
We all have something that makes us run properly, and our workplaces most often do not accommodate us for us to operate in an optimum fashion. And it's all the things that you mentioned. It could be the perimenopausal woman who is completely upended by temperature changes in her workplace. It could be somebody who, like my wife, suffered a very bad concussion at work, and suddenly strobing or bright lights caused her problems.
Yep.
And still do. So I agree with you that the conversation is not starting in the right place. And I can imagine in the C-suite or in the leadership realm, the senior leadership realm, they're like, oh yeah, we got to do this. So, let's provide headphones for everybody, that type of thing.
Yeah. But I also think we can't chastise our leadership teams, because I want to be mindful of the generation that we're talking about in our leadership C-suites. Okay. That cohort of individuals typically are of a certain boomer above kind of range, when if you look back to the foundations by which they grew up, their childhood, access to education, college, when you look at the world that they grew up in, if somebody was different, and I would bet that their mothers or grandmothers, so boomers, grandmothers, were of a generation that if a woman was struggling with postpartum depression after a baby, their husband would put them in an institution and the child would never see them again, right? And that didn't really, our boomer generation, these people who are in charge of these big leadership initiatives, they grew up at a time when if you were different, I bet you, well, in most of the conversations that I have, I always ask them, think back to elementary days. There was that one kid in class that was maybe, blurting out random things or was just a little off. And then one day they just disappeared, right? And these kids were never told why. And so if they grew up at a time when, if you were not compliant and you did not follow the socially expected norm, then you were at risk of disappearing. And that, in a neurally developing child, sets deep-rooted foundations in their belief system. They've now grown up, and while they've been growing up and chasing societally expected norms, neuroscience has been doing their work. We've been doing research. We've been learning more and more about the brain, okay? But they were already on their path, and now they're in a leadership position, and the worlds have now kind of combined.
Right.
And so we're asking them to stop and think of their workplaces in these terms like, you know, neuroinclusive and neurodiversity. And we're asking them to create these very human-centric policies, programs, and places. And oftentimes it is a checkbox because it's not the world they grew up in. And so I do want to give that general cohort a little bit of grace. They do not get a free pass. And I will go toe-to-toe with any executive any day, because you do not get a free pass, but you do get some grace because it is not the world you grew up in, but that's also not the world that you're living in right now. And so we have an entire generation of young adults and kids that are coming up who have the language, who have the evaluations, who have the knowledge, and who are coming fast and furious, and they're going to ask you for things that if they don't get them, you will lose talent.
Right. Agreed. Fran, you had a follow-up.
Yeah, this may be a bit of a strange turn, but I'm just thinking about, you know, the list of the 25% of people who have one or more of the common forms of neurodiversity. If we looked at a characteristic like introversion and extroversion, you know, virtually the entire population falls into one or the other side of that descriptor.
Or do they?
Or both.
Do they?
Well, actually, I had in my own mind, I think it's about 40% extroverts and maybe 50% 40% introverts, 50% extroverts, and then 10% of oddballs, you know, the guys that
ambiverts.
Yeah. How does something like, because everybody or most people, let's put it, it well beyond the 25% level, that you know, we have this not issue, but it's a reality of people. Is that something we need to deal with, or is that just such a common trait that it's not addressed in any type of pathogenic behavior or oddball behavior, whatever you want to call it?
Well, think about it this way. I mean, so where do these things come from? Introvert, extrovert, type A, type B personality, neurotypical, neurodivergent. Where do these terms come from? They're built on societal constructs trying to wrap our brains around understanding human needs. And because every brain and body is so unique and different, what works for me is not going to work for you, Fran. It's not going to work for Dan. And we, all three of us, could be navigating a physical space and all need very different things. That is very, as a society that needs some level of structure, that's a hard thing to understand. And so you have to put these social constructs, introvert, extrovert. Why does it matter?
Right.
What, I mean, that's the thing. It's like it only matters to individuals and organizations that actually want to try to, and I'm going to say this and I might get some backlash, but command and control. Right. And that's just not the world that we live in anymore. I mean, I see it in my classrooms. Students are not, I mean, K through 12 is different, but at the higher ed level, my kids don't sit in rows and rows of seats. And if they do, I move them. Right. I mean, they're not growing up in a world and in a society where, you know, you're given, you are a type A kid, or, you know, I mean, I was wild as a child. I mean, you can imagine. I was wild. I was mental. I was the extrovert. But actually, I don't really like people. Like, I would rather be in a room by myself with a glass of wine and a book and writing all day long, every day, than be in any sort of networking social environment. But if you were to meet me, you would assume that I was an extrovert. That's a social construct that they, the other people in my world, put on me. That's not my lived and learned experience. It's not inherently who I am. There are times when I can be very extroverted. There are times where I desire to be introverted. And honestly, if you made me pick binary between the two, I would lean more towards introverted, which For people who only know me in a specific context, they'd be like, there's no way. But that's the truth.
I got to get to some viewer questions. This thing's lighting up. Lorraine, you're new to this conversation. Thank you for joining us today. She writes, I appreciate the description of senior leaders. I am struggling to understand how to manage staff where individuals need to engage and work differently. The accommodations are usually seen as perks. Yeah, bingo. Right on the money, Lorraine. Thank you. To that point, I think we, and Fran and Mark, who's not here, but the three of us, when we've had these conversations, they usually often start with venue.
Yeah.
And then the people who are going to the various venues and what the work is and how do they do it. So that HR people, a lot of them are still doing the bring them in, onboard them, get them set up, rinse and repeat.
Mm-hmm.
What made this topic today so interesting, how to develop and to establish a neuro-inclusive workplace, is maybe, to Lorraine's point, when we bring people in, we should be getting to know how do they operate.
Yeah.
What's their secret sauce? What makes them blissful? And what individuates them so that we create the optimum conditions for them to thrive. And when they thrive, the company is going to enjoy more return on investment.
Mm-hmm. More loyalty, more innovation.
Can we talk about that a little bit, Kelly?
Oh, gladly. I love this part. So, because I do have a pretty big soapbox that honestly, my entire private practice is really built around this concept of foundational literacy. And to Lorraine's point, the challenge that leaders have, whether they're managers or executives, is that we don't have a society that is built on a foundational literacy of these topics. So that's point one, and I'll come back to that. The other point is, these accommodations as seen as perks. Yeah. If you actually look at your workplace and you're asking the question of how are we, our meeting, our onboarding, our whatever our practices and programs and policies are, if we ask ourselves, how could this be excluding anyone? And I think most people will say, we want to make accommodations for somebody who is cognitively different, who's autistic. I just want to know what I need to do to provide them X, Y, Z. That's why it's seen as a perk. Because that very conversation of accommodations, like we want to give accommodations to a small cohort of people. Well, yeah, of course it's going to look like a perk to them. To the people who are getting it, it's necessary. But that shifts, that is by the very nature, that conversation is in fact exclusionary if you pull back the onion. So what I'm saying is we build a foundational literacy, understanding what are the diagnostic criteria, what are the lived and learned experiences of somebody who is dyslexic, who has sensory integration issues, who has global dyspraxia, who has autism, who has ADHD. I'm not saying our managers or our leaders need to be experts in these things, but if they have a foundational understanding of what these neurotypes are, and then they start asking themselves, okay, we're not going to see these things as perks. How are we implementing onboarding and interviewing? Is our interview process, is our onboarding process by its very nature exclusionary, meaning we only have one type of interview. It's only eyeball to eyeball. Okay, that's great, except there is an entire cohort of human beings on this planet who don't do their best work eyeball to eyeball. So can you offer interview candidates a walking interview, a shoulder to shoulder interview? Maybe if somebody is, give them a hit list of, when you're scheduling your interview, what kind of environment would you interview best in?
Stop right there. This is brilliant. A walking interview. If you are, if your neurotype is,
what difference does it make?
It is, I operate well when I'm that person. I used to operate with a headset when I was in recruitment. And my watch would log 12,000 steps. Why? Because when I was on the phone interviewing candidates, I was up and down the stairs. I was pulling laundry out of the dryer. I was doing all these things, and it worked for me. I love that.
Well, so I'm going to pause you for a second. Again, not a neuroscientist, but I want you to think about the cognitive effort that somebody who's interviewing, or the candidate who is being interviewed, or example yourself while you're interviewing a candidate, the cognitive load that your brain is processing at that moment, the tone of the person's voice, you're reading their resume, right? I want you to really sit and think about what is happening in your brain and body, in the person you're interviewing, in their brain and body. That is a tremendous amount of cognitive and physical effort. So why do we walk when we talk? Why do I have fidgets all the time? Why is shoulder to shoulder interaction while you're walking? Why does that breed the most authentic conversations?
Right.
Because when we give our bodies even something small like a fidget, right? Even something like, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be tapping your fingers, it could be anything. But when you give your body something to do, your physical body, it offloads that cognitive effort so that your brain can focus where it needs to focus. Imagine, doesn't matter, neurotypical, neurodivergent, I don't care. Those are social constructs that I don't think are based in reality, my personal opinion. So if you are a human being and you are sitting in a conference room, you are already anxious, you are already nervous, you're in an unfamiliar environment with unfamiliar people, you're probably sitting in the worst interview environment, maybe a conference room that's got a fishbowl. Talk about, I mean, if you look at what's happening to that person, right? And you're saying, well, why didn't they interview well? I don't know, you just put them on display, right? So when I work with people and they say, well, we want to really, create a neuro-inclusive environment, policy, practice, workplace, I always ask them, what are you doing that could possibly be excluding others? And how can you reframe what you're doing as a practice to be more inclusionary? And that's just one example. What would be the harm of doing a walking interview with someone? Or if you had someone who's scheduling an interview at XYZ time and you give them a list, would you prefer, sitting next to one another in a comfier sort of casual room like I'm in right now? Would you prefer a traditional conference room? Would you prefer a walking interview when you come on site? Also, think about once that interview is scheduled. So we're not even talking about the physical environment right now. If you're thinking, okay, I'm a candidate, I'm coming to an unfamiliar location, I don't know where to park, I'm not sure who I'm going to see when I get there, I'm wearing uncomfortable clothes that I don't normally wear because interview still requires you to wear a stupid suit. So I'm already not knowing, where do I go? How long do I need to get there? I need to map it out beforehand. And how many interview candidates have been given a packet that just says date, time, bring your license? And when you think about all of the mental and cognitive effort that's necessary to put together an action plan just to get to the front door, you are already setting your candidate up for failure. How difficult would it be to put together a day plan, right? Show up at this time, you're going to walk to this person, you're going to meet this person, that makes a massive difference when you've taken that mental load off of your candidate, and so they can show up in an interview format that works for them with all of the information they need for their brain to show up in the best way. You don't need to be autistic to benefit from that.
I want to back up everything you're saying, and it comes from 20 years as a headhunter, as a recruiter. In all that time, the constants were always, we do a pre-phone interview. When video became a thing, we do Zoom, and then we put this person face to face, and everything had commonality to it. Why? Because interviewers thought that was useful. If I keep the way I interview this person constant, I can look at the differences between Joe and Fran and Kelly and Dan. But that doesn't tell you that you're picking the right person, or that any of the candidates that you have there are giving their best. So when we talk about how do I establish a neuro-inclusive workplace, we're not talking about furniture necessarily.
No,
We're
that should be,
talking
honestly, the physical environment should have, I mean, it has a
right.
big part. Once they're actually physically there, the physical environment has a tremendously big opportunity to detrimentally impact humans. I'm not belaying that, but I'm
Right.
talking the policies and programs before they even set foot on your campus.
Right. And the easy part about this is for interviewers, both team leaders and HR people and support staff who might be part of the interview process,
Yeah.
should allow individuation so that that candidate gives their very best. And that's how you create talent that want to stay at your company, because it's like, okay, they get me.
Yep.
I'm not perfect, but when Kelly interviewed me, she said, how do you like to be interviewed? And she gave examples. Do you like face-to-face? Do you like walking through a courtyard? How do you find yourself to be your best? And I got to do that. And oh, by the way, since that's happened, I'm crushing it because I feel heard. I feel respected. I feel that I am working on a foundation of trust.
Yeah.
And I can see the next steps. I can see how I can build this because I can be my authentic self. Have I left anything out there, Kelly?
Nope. Well done.
Fran?
Yeah, Kelly, just in listening to this discussion, there must be diagnostic tools that are available to organizations to help them further understand their people. And certainly in the age of AI, where everybody's taken personality profiles and they've asked the same question 4 ways, and AI can determine, easily, which categories of diversity, neurodiversity issues they may or may not have, or where there may be some issues there, or maybe some suggestions that would help management understand how to best interview, how to best organize, how to best staff that person, and keep them, part of the happy part of the employment group. But aren't there tools that are available to HR now that would really
tools. So we have the clinical framework, which again, from a diagnostic criteria, you need to be a licensed clinician to do. But DSM-5, which is on the verge of being reevaluated, that provides the medical modality to have diagnosis. So if somebody were to say to you, all right, Fran, I have ADHD. Okay. I have, a learning disability as it pertains to math. I also have and struggle with anxiety, and I have sensory processing integration issues, specifically as it pertains to dyspraxia. Right. So I could say all of those things to you.
Right.
None of those words, unless you've learned about them, are going to mean anything to you as a leader.
Right.
And so that's why I really, most people want to talk about a checklist. All right, I have an ADHD employee. Give me the 16 things I need to do to make it. And that, because everyone's needs are very, very different. My son, by the way, has the exact same clinical diagnosis that I have. His needs are radically different than mine. Now, he's also a boy and I'm a female. So obviously the way that we show up in the world is going to be different. But on paper, we are clinically the same. And this is where I think sort of AI, which I do endorse using, but I think AI tools can sometimes get it wrong, because I could put all of those words I just said to you, you could put them into AI and ask it to give you the 16 things that are going to support someone with that diagnosis. And maybe they're great for me, but they're going to be detrimental to my son. And so there really isn't a implementation checklist to say, do these XYZ things and it's going to work, because it is human beings, neurotypical or neurodivergent alike, are a spectrum, and we will always get it wrong. And in a society that doesn't like to fail and doesn't like to get stuff wrong, that is not what people want to hear. They want to hear, I'm going to roll out this, whatever. I'm going to hire a consultant and I'm going to spend all this money. I'm going to modify my physical environment. And, oh, by the way, you're probably still going to get it wrong a very large percentage of the time.
Right. And certainly potential employees or applicants are not going to volunteer that they're ADHD.
No, especially not in today's day and age.
But I would think at this point, we should easily be able to craft a 300 question form that the applicant would take, and that from the answers you could establish this profile and probably be fairly comfortable that this candidate is a little bit this way, a little bit that way,
but it wouldn't matter though. That's you're on the right track, but
right.
I'm going to push on you for a second because it wouldn't matter. Okay, so what you're saying is I could give an onboarding employee, or even through an interview, sort of a set of questions. I mean, you're going to learn a lot about human needs just through, like, do you prefer a walking shoulder to shoulder interview versus a traditional conference room? You're going to learn a lot about a human. But what you're specifically talking about, how do you like your meeting minutes? Do you prefer, context in an agenda 24 hours before your meetings, right? If you start asking some of these generalized questions, it doesn't matter whether that person who's answering them has ADHD, autism,
right,
or nothing clinically diagnosed. So when we're talking about true neuroinclusion, I'm really trying to push on people to stop thinking that it's trying to shove neurodivergent individuals into a neurotypical, physical environment, and we've got to modify this ever so slightly so they don't fall out through the cracks. No. What we're talking about is true neuroinclusion, where you're merging everything together and you're seeing humans as humans, not this binary neurotypical or neurodivergent. And that, I think, is not necessarily seen in conversations that I'm having. But what you're talking about is the right step. Ask those questions about how do you best operate as a human, physical human, in this environment, or in this meeting, or in this policy and program.
And how empowering is that? If you tell a future employee, tell us what makes you your best self, your most productive self, that turns an employee into a stakeholder.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and there is some concern. I do hear some backlash from leadership. Oh, everyone's going to have what they want, and we're accommodating people, and we're catering and kowtowing to people. Or, if we customize everything, that's going to be really time consuming and expensive. Because our inherent human bias, we've all been raised in an environment where anything that is customized is expensive. And that's not true.
Right.
And so I think there's this underlying belief that if I start to modify and make these changes in policies and programs and physical workplaces, if I start to ask people, what is your preference? There's this inherent expectation from leadership that employees are going to take advantage of them, or that it's going to be really expensive and hard to manage, 100 different employees' needs. Then you need to ask yourself, how are you measuring productivity? What do you actually want? Do you want humans, or do you want robots doing your work? I mean, these are real big conversations that need to happen, because human beings are not drones. We're not robots. We're not going to sit in one location and do the same thing over and over again for the next 40 years. Those days are over.
So I want to get to the point about education. And as I'm hearing you talk, I'm thinking about what my daughter, who had health issues that caused her to be sinkable. She crashed on the floor and got head trauma, and spent 18 months homebound from school. And I'm thinking to myself, this kid's going to have a rough start. You want to know what turned it around, Kelly? Special education. Right. Because it's not a 504 plan. It's something that works with my child to figure out what she needs to do to be a success. They figured out her learning preferences. They figured out her engagement preferences. And this kid who was literally homebound in bed for 18 months, graduated with honors with an advanced diploma. So I mention this because the model can easily be applied to the workplace.
Absolutely.
So I want to ask one just quick question about what you're experiencing in the classroom with the students that you have as they fret about getting into careers and into workplaces? What things are you hearing, and what opportunities are percolating up from your conversations with them?
Well, I mean, I'm at the higher ed sector, but I will say this much. I have been involved in special ed now with all four of my children for over 25 years. I've been an advocate at the K through 12 level. So I've been involved in the special ed process, IEPs, 504s. For those of you who might not know what that is, it's an individualized education plan. Sole focus is to provide a student with the least restrictive environment so that they can be integrated into the curriculum. That being said, those requirements, those individualized plans that support students in K through 12 disappear in higher ed.
Right.
They go away. Once they matriculate into higher ed, you can have students that will get accommodations through the college, which is what I see. And those accommodations are very similar to an IEP, but the regulatory and compliance process is completely different.
Right.
And the ownership of that process is different.
Right.
So in higher ed, what I'm seeing is a massive, massive deficit in executive function. Massive. These students, I love my students. I don't know that I could say that with more passion. There isn't a moment, even in the most difficult time with a student, there isn't a moment where I don't sit shoulder to shoulder to one of those kids and I think, I am the literal luckiest human on this planet to get to sit and hold presence with this human as they navigate this process, because they are dealing with a lot. They are still a product of the pandemic. If they are neurodivergent, cognitively different, they are already dealing with challenges. Right. You layer on executive function, that's things like time management, organizing, planning, problem solving, self-advocacy. You start layering that on, and now these kids are really struggling. My student population in the last 3 years of students who are requiring special accommodations, meaning they get my notes in advance, they get access to teacher notes, they get access to the PowerPoints, right? They could be extra time on tests. There's 1,000 things that I could be asked to provide. My student population has more than doubled in the last 3 years in the college that I teach at predominantly. That population has doubled in the needs for accommodations. And so we are seeing a massive, massive uptick, and specifically supporting accommodations at the higher ed level. And guess what? They don't go away when they graduate 4 years later. They're bringing those needs to your workplace.
I want to bring you back this fall, if we could. We love you, Kelly. We want to bring you back because this has been riveting, and hopefully Mark will be able to be a part of this as well this fall. I want to get into all that in terms of what the entry-level talent pool is dealing with and how we can turn that into an advantage. So thank you for that. Before we get to the final question for you, how would people watching or listening to you today engage with you? How would they find you on social media? How would they have a conversation?
I'm everywhere. All the social media handles, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Of course, I write on LinkedIn, my website. I would say email me. I'm going to be 100% honest. Email is not the best form of communication with me. Send me something there. I'll eventually get it. But any of those other social media channels and the DMs that are there, or simply call me. Pick up the phone and call me, or send me a text.
Wonderful. We got to get to the final question, and it's one we ask every guest. So, Kelly, what's your work fit? What attribute, condition, experience, place, or state of mind makes the work that you do a wonderful part of your day, perhaps doing other wonderful things, and this is the most important part, not the all-consuming time suck of the day?
I am the most grateful, honest, and humbled by the work that I get to do, supporting cognitively different individuals navigate a societal system that has excluded them for generations. And I love nothing more than going shoulder to shoulder and watching our next generation succeed despite all of that.
I am blown away by that. That is one of the most profound answers to this question I've heard in over 3 years of doing this live show. Thank you so much. I mean it. We got to get you back this fall. Can we do it?
Absolutely. Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, to everybody, thank you for this wonderful spring season. We'll see you over the summer with some pre-recorded shows, and then hopefully Kelly this fall with another live show. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.